Good morning. Title of the sermon is David. If you're saying, wait a minute here, that's pretty dark text for David, very dark gray. Yes, it is. So one of the neat things about the lectionary is that it actually moves through an Old Testament book rather systematically. So we've been going through the book of Samuel. We haven't focused on it every week, but we focused on it. This is the third series on David, and the book of Samuel is all about David. And so we've been looking at David, and we're sort of going to kind of bring that to a conclusion, a finale today. So David means beloved, beloved by God. To get a sense of the importance of David, for Israel, you have to take kind of George Washington and combine him with Abraham Lincoln and combine him with Billy Graham, because he was the military leader who brought the nation together. He was the political leader who unified the nation, and he was the religious leader, the spiritual leader who made Israel into a worshiping people. And he's the person who starts to write the Psalms, and it begins in his time. Without David, there's no Jerusalem, because he's the one who established Jerusalem as the capital. Without David, there's no Israel. You don't have any Jerusalem, you really don't have any Israel, at least Israel as we know it. You don't have Judaism as we know it, and therefore you don't have any Christianity as we know it. David is, a number of Psalms are attributed to him, but two in particular are two prayers. The 51st Psalm, a prayer of confession after he seduces Bathsheba and is confronted by Nathan, and the 23rd Psalm, the most beloved Psalm in the Bible, in fact, among the most beloved scriptures in the Bible, the Lord is my shepherd. Finally, the phrase that is attributed to him, not once but twice, and it's the only place in the scriptures where this affirmation is found. David is referred to as a person after God's own heart. Yeah. I mean, it's a powerful statement, but as we talked about earlier, what does it mean? What does that mean? It appears not only in the Old Testament, but it is used in the New Testament to talk about David, but also to talk about how we get to the person of Jesus. So it's pretty important to maybe understand what that is about. So that's what we're going to try to do a little bit today. So we've been moving through kind of the big pieces of David's life. And of course, the big first piece is when he's 14, 15, 16 years old. No one is willing to go up against Goliath, this Philistine giant, and David says that he will fight him. And so that story that we teach in Sunday school and every kid knows is a great story. It's often seen as against astronomical odds because of God. God reverses those odds, and David is victorious, even though it's like 1 out of a million chance of him defeating Goliath. But he does. That's the way God works. But then we looked about a different way of looking at the story. When you look a little more deeply, it's a little bit different than maybe you expect. And we looked at how Malcolm Gladwell wrote a whole book about how surprised he was when he really looked at this story for what it is. When he really looked at the fact that slings weren't children's toys. They were these incredible, powerful weapons and could be incredibly accurate. And the idea within 15 or 20 feet, really, it is Goliath, not David, but Goliath who is the sitting duck, with David having a sling. How the story's very different when you really look at it deeply. That it's more a story not about God taking that 1 in a million possibility and making it happen. It's really about a God who works through David, through his body and his mind and his spirit, using his gifts, using his talent, using his own humility. I can't take on this guy in hand-to-hand combat, so I better find another way. All of that is how it works. And that was real powerful for Malcolm Gladwell. It really was a game changer for him personally, because that understanding of God resonated with the way he saw God at work in the world. Not a God who does all of it, but a God who works through us. In this case, works through David. So, great story, right? Well, it goes on. David eventually is kind of competing with Saul. Who will be the king? David feels that God has called him. Samuel the prophet has revealed that God has called him to be the king. But Saul is, in essence, he is the king. But then when Saul dies at the very end of 1 Samuel, David truly becomes king. And shortly thereafter, there's this wonderful story of David moving the capital to Jerusalem. And so they take the Ark of the Covenant. And if you remember Indiana Jones, the Ark of the Covenant that they would take with them into battle, now they take it and they bring it to Jerusalem. And the idea is they're eventually going to build a temple. Actually, that never gets built, at least in David's time. It doesn't get built, I should say. But it says that David dances before the ark. Yeah, it's just this wonderful story in the 6th chapter of 2 Samuel. And the king, the former king's daughter, Saul's daughter, she thinks David is... it's wrong for him in kind of a loincloth to dance. It's not fitting the king. Here he is, the king, and he's doing this crazy dance in a loincloth. And she calls him a fool. And he basically says, to be a fool praising God is a fool that I want to be. Yeah, it's a wonderful story. Again, a part of David, of who he is. And maybe part of what is the heart after God's own heart. What you find in the second Samuel, the first 10 chapters, is David unifies and builds the nation. And so while the Philistines are the external enemy of Israel, Goliath was a Philistine, the truth is that the land is controlled by numerous clan leaders or warlords. And David, what he does is he finds a way to gain their allegiance. That's how he unifies the nation. But the way he does it is by making clan leaders family members his wives or concubines. Concubine is essentially the same thing as a wife. It actually says that David has 8 wives and hundreds of concubines. Yet his son Solomon would follow in his father's footsteps and have 700 wives and 300 concubines. So this is actually David's strategy for unifying the nation, for basically marrying all these clan leader family members, and to a certain extent, it works. David does truly bring the nation together. And he makes Israel into something that in its 3,000-year history, it has rarely had. Peace and prosperity for about 40 years. Yet that brings us to another epic story of David that we looked at 2 weeks ago, the story of David and Bathsheba, and also Nathan the prophet. Now David is in late 40s, maybe even 50 years of age, the middle-aged, powerful monarch, at the height of his power, and yes, the height of his own arrogance. And he seduces Bathsheba. That story with Bathsheba becoming pregnant and David coming up with a plan to cover up. And that cover-up goes awry, leading to David ruthlessly killing Bathsheba's husband Uriah to hide his adultery. If you remember, David writes to Joab, his chief of staff and a powerful military leader, one who would be forever loyal to David, to have Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, put on the front of the battle and to have everyone else come back so that Uriah would be struck down. And David has the audacity to put his wax seal on that letter. He writes out Uriah's death sentence, part of this cover-up strategy, and then gives that sealed letter to Uriah and says, take this to Joab. And while that should have been the end, this successful cover-up, it isn't. As Nathan the prophet brilliantly confronts David with the truth through the story of a rich man who takes the lamb of a poor man who has nothing in all of life except for this little lamb. And the rich man takes that lamb and he butchers it and he serves it at a great feast that he is throwing for some dignitary. And when David hears that story that Nathan tells, which is actually a parable, not a current event, David hears that story. He is filled with righteous anger. And he says, that man deserves to die. And then with fear and trembling, Nathan the prophet says to David, you're the man. You're the rich man. You're the one who took Bathsheba and committed adultery. And you're the one who killed her husband Uriah to cover it up. That epic story of David and Bathsheba is told in 2 Samuel 11 and 12. It happens when David is middle-aged. And of course, that story ends with him choosing not to kill Nathan the prophet, which in some ways would have been a continuation of his rather mercenary, treacherous way of covering up at all cost. But instead he cries out, I've sinned against the Lord. And there's this emergence of this softened heart. And then we get the 51st Psalm, which is that great psalm of repentance. Create in me a clean heart, O God. Put a new and right spirit within me. Against you, you alone have I sinned. And what I offer to you, Lord, is a soft heart, a humble heart, a bruisable heart. And it says that's the offering that God desires. Well, unfortunately, that little prayer of confession was short-lived. Yeah. After that story, the next 20 years of his life is like one tragedy after another after another. It reads like a Shakespearean tragedy. What happens next? Well, there's the confrontation. What happens next is that David's oldest son, his firstborn child, Amnon, slotted to be king, but not David's favorite son. David did play favorites. You're not supposed to do that, but he does. His oldest son lusts for his sister Tamar and seduces her, and when she resists, Amnon kills his sister Tamar. David's third son, Absalom, who is David's favorite, and who is smart and handsome, but with beautiful long flowing hair, but also very, very full of himself. Absalom avenges his sister's death by killing Amnon. David doesn't know what to do. In some way, as he is witnessing a civil war within his own family, which Nathan the prophet had said would be a part of the consequence of David's unscrupulous and deeply immoral behavior, even though he softened his heart at the end. There were consequences for what he did. Well, David is overwhelmed with grief, and he becomes something of a basket case, both morally but also politically and even militarily. He begins to listen to a wide range of advisors, some with good advice, but most giving him bad advice. David forgives Absalom, and yet Absalom, ever the narcissist, sees his father's forgiveness of him for killing his brother as weakness. That's right. Absalom then begins to plot the overthrow of his father. Absalom is smart and cunning and completely amoral. While he avenged his sister Tamar's seduction and death at the hands of Amnon, he himself seduces David's wives and concubines. He does this to show his complete contempt for his father, and also to prove that his father David has become weak and powerless, which in many ways is true. Through chapters 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17, it goes about as bad as it possibly can for David. Absalom is rapidly peeling off David's leaders and securing them on his side. With each betrayal of David, Absalom's contempt for his father intensifies. All the while, he is openly seducing David's royal concubines and wives. Finally, Absalom has gained the upper hand, and it appears that it's only a matter of time before Absalom will overthrow David and kill his father. David is forced to flee Jerusalem, taking with him his ever loyal and brilliant, but also ruthless top general Joab, and a small portion of soldiers that are basically the few that are staying loyal to him. And then what happens is that in this epic battle, somehow it doesn't go away. The Absalom expects it to go. Somehow, even though Absalom has the upper hand, David's soldiers prevail, partly because of the ruthlessness and the cunning and the brilliance of Joab. David, by the way, is not a part of the battle. He stays behind. Joab's brilliant shine and David's forces, led by Joab, force Absalom into a complete retreat. As Absalom is retreating, riding a mule, he rides underneath an oak tree, and his long, beautiful hair gets tangled in the low branches. The mule keeps going, and Absalom is left dangling from the tree. David's soldiers see Absalom with his hair stuck in the tree, and they report this to Joab, knowing that David has told them to deal gently with Absalom. David had said, go gentle on Absalom. Don't kill him. He's my son, even though he's trying to kill me. Yet when Joab is told where Absalom is, he totally disregards what David says, and he executes Absalom, he and his men. By the way, he makes sure that that message doesn't get to David, just that Absalom is dead. When David hears about Absalom's death, without any of the details, he is beside himself with grief. He weeps and cries, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I have died instead of you, O Absalom, my son Absalom." Got a picture there of him with his hair tangled. And then those words of David, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I have died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son." Well, the last six chapters of Samuel, which accompany maybe the last 12 to 15 years of David's life, are not flattering at all for David. Absalom's revolt results in wave after wave of revolts against David. Joab, who is ever loyal to David, cunning and ruthless as he quells each assault on the king. But David is a broken and traumatized man. The final chapter of the book, just before David dies at the age of 70, is really convoluted, here's the great king, right? The story should end with some sort of a great final note, but it doesn't. In the last chapter, David senses that God is calling him to do a census, to take accounting of the number of people and the wealth of the land and all the things that he has done. Yet when David takes the census, God is angry, suggesting that perhaps it wasn't God who directed David, but his own ego that wanted to be stroked by the size and the strength of the nation that he had built. In response to David's census, God brings a plague on the people. And the last chapter of his life ends with David broken. It ends with David praying to God, finding a way out from this horrible mess that he has brought on. There is a humility that somehow he has brought this wrath of God upon the people. And that's the way it ends. It ends on that note. There's no little bow at the end. It ends pretty much tragically. So here's the question, that when you really read the story of David, when you look at the whole 1st and 2nd Samuel and all the stories, and not just the David and Goliath and maybe dancing before, but the whole story, the seduction of Bathsheba, the ruthlessness, the murder of Elijah. Yes, the humble heart, but then really the latter half of his life, just sort of moral bankruptcy and really a traumatized person whose own son seeks to kill him. This is the real David, okay? The real David. So how is the real David the person after God's own heart? That's really a bigger question when you really look at the story. The statement that appears not once but twice, and actually it is used to talk about the David that leads to Jesus in the New Testament. How do you get there? How do you get there? Well, There's no definitive answer to that question. I mean, it's not like, it answers that question. This is what it is. But I just want to offer, after looking at this for the last 6 weeks, a little bit of maybe the way I make sense of it. Maybe what it is that allows us to connect the real David with the person after God's own heart. And it has to do with the 23rd Psalm. This incredible psalm it's really not necessarily a beautiful picture. I mean, the first part of it is wonderful, but, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for thou art with me. That even in the midst of the darkest time somehow finds a way for God to be present. And so the way that I get at this story is, traditionally this story is posited early on. That when David is a shepherd, right? He's a shepherd, and this is a shepherd's story. It's a shepherd's prayer, and the enemies are those who would attack the sheep. And, that story makes sense, and that's one way to understand it. But I think when you posit this story at the very end of his life, it's a very different prayer. And in some ways, it's a much more powerful understanding of a humble David. And the clue that this might be the case is in that very last chapter, right? David hasn't been a shepherd for 55 years. It's been 55 years since he's been a shepherd. But at the very end of the book of Samuel, David prays this prayer. Remember, he's brought this plague upon the people because he did the census and he feels horrible. And he prays this prayer. He prays this prayer to God. I have sinned. I, the shepherd, have done wrong. These are but sheep. What have they done? Let your punishment fall on me and my family. Because we're deserving of it, right? Yeah, we brought it on. So now I'd like you to let's just walk through. Let's just walk through the 23rd Psalm and see if maybe that makes a little sense. The 23rd Psalm, a psalm of David, a prayer of David. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. I shall not be in want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, used to sort of chasten the sheep, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. If that's David's prayer at the end of his life, when he, says those words and refers to a shepherd, I the shepherd, I think in some ways it allows the real David, with all of his brilliance, but all of his brokenness, with his weakness, with his narcissism at times. In many ways, he's the model of his son Absalom. In many ways, he's as ruthless as his son Absalom at different times in his life. And yet at times, his heart is softened. The person who is capable of doing great evil finds himself in the midst of the valley of the shadow of death, brought on by himself. And still, God is with him. And still he can say, I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Through it all, That's where I choose to be. Despite it all, that's where I choose to be. The real me. That's what I choose to be. I think that is a person after God's own heart. Amen.